matter under heaven. It is spring, O God, and joy runs warm. And there is the mystery and the smile of it. The buds are starting to swell on the bushes, and the sun is beginning to coax color from the earth. It is spring, O God, and something is stirring, reaching, stretching, peaking, beckoning, and pulsing. And there is the mystery and the smile of it. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sister Rosalie. Joshua Holst is our speaker tonight, and he's an environmental activist, an expert on human rights and the environment. He worked for nonprofits in the Americas, West Africa, Southeast Asia. He has received grants from the National Science Foundation and Inter-American Foundation to study natural resources, development, and conflict. Tonight, he speaks to us on the topic of violence in our global economy. So we welcome Josh to speak to us. Just a thought, if you wish to be in speaker view, that might be helpful to you. And if you go to your upper right corner where it says view, you can click on that and choose speaker view if you wish to.
Cheryl, would you press the record button?
I already did.
Okay.
Josh, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually my second time. I sat in on your last meeting. It was really wonderful. So I am gonna share my screen here. Can you all see the opening PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
Yes.
So I have a PhD in applied anthropology, which, if you don't know what that is, my parents still ask me on occasion to remind them. Basically, anthropologists study human systems, and my work is about applying that study to social problems. I've worked with nonprofits all over the world, but really anthropology is just an excuse for me to continue my work on globalization. I became interested in globalization way back in the mid-90s when I was still pretty young, which incidentally is the period where globalization was really kicking off. So this graph shows foreign direct investment. And as you can see, it's just kind of exploded, especially starting there in the 1990s, where increases in foreign direct investment from the United States became exponentially increasing. This is facilitated by trade agreements, international organizations like the World Trade Organization. But at the same time, there are a lot of resistances to these processes. Labor unions in particular were upset about the loss of jobs. And as well, even when jobs aren't lost directly, competing against labor markets where human rights aren't observed or labor is increasingly exploitative. Environmentalists, for their part, were concerned about the erosion of local environmental protections as the economy became increasingly globalized. And they're also very concerned about the intensification of exploitation of natural resources. So these are clips from particularly high-profile protests that happened in 1999 in Seattle, where teachers, union organizers all came together en masse to stop a meeting of the World Trade Organization, which is an international organization which facilitates free trade and often is involved in cutting down those local labor laws and local environmental laws and facilitates that process. So this was in 1999, but a lot of the organizing for this started in 1994, coincidentally, when NAFTA was signed. So the North American Free Trade Agreement was the very first in this wave of free trade agreements that then have increased and intensified and become more and more free as time has gone on. Incidentally, on the very day that NAFTA was signed, it kicked off an insurrection in Chiapas, Mexico, the southernmost province or state of Mexico. the idea was that free trade led to exploitation that hurt the poor, especially in Mexico, in addition to hurting the poor in the United States and Canada. The Zapatista rebellion had a figurehead who went by the name of Subcomandante Marcos Marcos. He was actually a philosophy professor, but he deferred to the Indigenous Congress of Chiapas, an autonomous self-organized democracy that was actually the result of the Catholic Church's efforts to organize the indigenous community going way back into the 1970s. So they had their own autonomous structure that Subcomandante Marcos Marcos, with his high media profile and also some of his military actions, was then supporting. Chiapas itself had natural resources in spades. It was Mexico's richest province in terms of natural resources, but it was also the highest incidence of poverty in all of Mexico. When I visited Chiapas in 1999, one of the villagers in Zapatista territory that I interviewed explained the conflict to me in a way that really stuck with me even today. What he said was, it is the presence of natural resource wealth that necessitates violence here. Basically, the idea was that democracy could not be allowed to interrupt the extraction of natural resources. In Chiapas, that was largely gas, oil, coffee, but also deforestation, timber. Deforestation had destroyed local rainfall patterns and pushed farmers off of their land, pushing people into a condition where they couldn't feed themselves. And sometimes reforestation campaigns were actually done with genetically modified eucalyptus trees that destroyed the soil and were on what was previously people's property that they didn't necessarily have the deed to. So there was this process of displacement that was happening that was directly facilitated by NAFTA. Among other things, the governor of Chiapas's work as a consultant for International Paper produced an enormous amount of clear cutting in the region. And as a result, much of the Lancandon cloud forest was turned into toilet paper, which is sold to us and ends up in our toilets here in the United States. So everything that you own has a story, and sometimes it's not a very nice one. I'm gonna skip ahead here. When you eat a banana, keep in mind that Chiquita Bananas was caught paying $1.7 million to death squads, and a subsidiary that Chiquita Bananas owned in Colombia was found guilty by the Organization of American States of smuggling assault rifles in, which were then used to arm right-wing paramilitaries. And I'll return to that a little bit later. When you put on some clothes, consider that 72 Thai nationals were found locked in an apartment building in Los Angeles. Some of them had been there for 8 years. Their families thought that they were dead while they were working to sew clothes that went to major brand names. Everything from the gasoline in your car to the materials used to make your computer that you're watching this on, and the mining process that went into acquiring those materials. All of those have a story, so many of which have really intense human and environmental costs. A lot of these things are invisible to us, and we tell ourselves that things like genocide and colonialism and slavery are all things of the past, but they continue to be fundamentally built into our way of life, no matter how much we tend to look or want to look the other way. Now, in order to really understand this, we really need to undo some of the ideas that we might hold about things like development and poverty. Now, when I teach, I have a whole month to convince students of this. I'm going to try to convince you guys this in a couple of minutes. So I might not be successful, but just maybe bear with me and open your minds to reconsidering this for a moment. Here I have some pictures of a woman that I saw that was homeless falling asleep on the subway next to me. In one picture, we've got a slum in Indonesia outside of ExxonMobil's natural gas operation, a giant Walmart parking lot here. The one in the middle is it's an indigenous village in Ecuador that's 3 days walking and boat to get there. So a lot of times the way we see these or perceive these different images, especially in relationship to development, is a little bit skewed and biased. So let me pull back and talk to you guys a little bit about what life is like in the Amazon rainforest. So first off, the Amazon is in several countries. It's not just in Brazil. And I'm going to mostly be talking about, I've worked in Ecuador and Colombia and Venezuela, but I'm mostly going to be talking about Ecuador and specifically Shuar and Quechua communities. So it's a very diverse place as well. So I don't want to give you the impression that I'm, when I'm saying Amazonian, there are a lot of commonalities, but there is a significant amount of variation there. So one key element of being in the Amazon is drinking games. In fact, it seems like there's just a new drinking game every day that just doesn't end. And this one in particular, you need to hit the banana with a blowgun. It's kind of target practice. And if you miss, you have to drink this drink called chicha, which is made from yucca that is unfermented and spent as alcoholic. It's a big feature at parties. That's what dinner looks like. But one of the more interesting aspects of life in the Amazon is how much work there is. For men, clearing fields, hunting, foraging, and fishing, you meet your whole family's dietary needs in about 3 hours of work a day. Women, they tend to engage in growing yucca, cooking, foraging, and fishing. Both of them, but especially women, have a lot of work that's not included here. That in child rearing, as I'm sure my mom could tell you, is an exhausting amount of work that's way more than 2 hours. But relatively speaking, 3 to 2 hours of work a day. Now, look at what I have to do when I'm teaching, right? A lot of times I'll end up putting in an 11 or, in worst case scenario, 15-hour day between reading, classwork, writing, all of this terrible bureaucratic paperwork that I have to do. So which of the two of us are really winning here in terms of this kind of a comparison? So I want to bring your attention to another kind of party called a minga, since there's a lot of parties that happen in the Amazon. This party is particularly interesting because you get about 30 people together. You show up at someone's house, there's dancing, people take turns drinking out of the chicha bowl, and then you move together from house to house. And on the way, you repair the roads, you fix bridges, you fix people's houses, and clear things out with a machete. And you go from house to house throughout the day with all 30 people. It's a way of doing collaborative labor. So in the minga that I attended, one of the things we did was remove this tree out of this bridge's roof. And the reason I took the picture the way that I did here with foregrounding this plant is because this plant is what's used to make the roof. If you look inside, you can see that the fronds from that plant, which was planted there on purpose. So in some anthropologists believe the Amazon in part is actually just an enormous garden. Was planted there on purpose and then harvested in order to repair the roof. The reason I think this is important to point out is because it relates to this concept of an ecological footprint. The ecological footprint for repairing and maintaining a bridge in the Amazon is incredibly low. But if you look at what we do in terms of how we eat, how we get to work, how all of the various things that might cost us very little money, they have an enormous cost in terms of the forest land, the grazing land, the transportation that was used to get it there, the packaging, the impacts on the oceans. So the amount of space that we're taking up as a footprint is dramatically different from the amount of space that's being taken up by some of the Amazonians that I was just talking about. This is how we make a bridge and how we maintain a bridge. Or in this case, it was actually tsunami houses in Indonesia. So this is a French concrete mine, which is used to process concrete in Indonesia. The labor conditions here, I mean, it exploded when there was a business for concrete after the tsunami hit Indonesia in 2004. And they wanted to replace everybody's wooden houses with these fancy new concrete houses that nobody necessarily really wanted. So they rebuilt everything using mining practices as opposed to the type of more sustainable practices that were previously used. And the labor conditions were so bad that in Indonesia, where labor conditions across the board are absolutely horrible, there is an all-out strike. They shut down the mine and reopened it with prison labor from China, all under Australian management. Meanwhile, in order to get the concrete, they basically cut mountains in half, which resulted in all kinds of erosion, all kinds of floods and landslides, which impacted rice farmers that were living in the area. So there was a really significant environmental impact that also produced a bunch of protests outside of the mine. So if we're going to compare ecological footprints here, and these are old statistics, they're actually way worse than the picture I'm painting right now, that Amazonians use 0.24% of their biocapacity. In the United States, we're using 200%. And this is actually from a few decades ago. So, but at that time, it was 833 times more, 833, right? If the whole world consumed what we do, it would take 4 to 5 Earths to maintain our current levels of consumption. I've seen various statistics, but usually they're between 4 and 5. The human race would die in an ecological collapse. And we're seeing that there is increasing ecological collapse happening from the 1700s here to here. This goes projecting into the future, but you can see a really significant difference just from 1950 to 2011 in terms of ecosystems around the globe, the proportion of ecosystems around the globe, which are enduring state shifts and are on the verge of collapse or have collapsed. And there's a really distinct pattern between whether it's happening in the global north and the wealthy countries or the global south and the poor. As globalization intensifies, it's really the global south that's bearing the ecological cost of the consumption that's happening in our country, with enormous amounts of ecological problems there. That leads to this idea of ecological debt. We owe an ecological debt to the global south. So we're less than 5% of the world's population. We consume 1/3 of the world's paper and like 1/4 of the world's oil. Again, these statistics are a little dated. With China, that might have shifted a little bit as well, in terms of species that are threatened or near extinction. For the most part, the drivers of these extinctions have been tied to specifically international trade. Meanwhile, it also affects us negatively in quite a few ways as well. As more and more of what we consume and the way that we survive comes from this transnational process, we need increasing space, shipping containers, increasing roads, increasing diesel transportation networks on trucks, increasing use of ships. The Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, if you combine them together, individually they're not, but they're right next to each other. So if you were to combine them together, they'd be the largest port in the United States. And its capacity is only increased exponentially as globalization and foreign direct investment has increased. Now, on this particular, it looks like the video might be covering what I want to show you on the map. But if you were to see the map, you could see in the very southernmost point, that's where the ports of LA and Long Beach are located. Along there, you have all of these boats idling off of the coast while they're waiting to unload the goods, producing this kind of brown soup in the air as they idle with diesel fuel. And then you have all of these trucks that are idling as well. So you go to the harbor area and the air is just visibly disgusting. Meanwhile, those trucks pass along this pink area all the way to downtown and then go out east towards San Bernardino. As a result, you have this corridor of terrible air, all kinds of NOx emissions, all kinds of particulates, and it coincides directly with low life expectancies. You can see that people in these neighborhoods, which are largely Latino and African American, live 10 years less than the people that are largely Caucasian that are living on the coast, where they have all this fresh air coming in from the ocean. That's also probably related to the fact that all of the chemical processing plants and toxic waste dumping is happening in those same areas. So you see that in neighborhoods of color and also neighborhoods along that same corridor, you've got the water supply is contaminated, and then those contaminants also seep back up into people's homes and schools in vapor intrusion. As a result, African Americans are 5 times more likely to die of asthma than Caucasians. And as well, all minorities are 3 times more likely to contract cancer. You go to San Bernardino, and that's where all the air kind of pools at the mountains, and kids who are playing outside and play sports are more likely to develop asthma than kids who stay inside. A soccer game is full of all of these asthma inhalers. So when we're thinking about development, there are good things related to what we have as a result of our particular development pathway, but it's not the only way that developments happen. Indigenous communities in the Amazon, they have their own trajectories of development. And one thing that's particularly interesting about those trajectories is, since it's not part of a globalized economy, if we wreck an ecosystem, we just go back to the grocery store and buy more. Their systems are embedded in local ecologies. If they weren't, they wouldn't be able to continue. So they've had to come up with ways to work with local ecologies in order to develop their particular systems. The Amazon in particular is famous for having complex democratic political systems. They have extremely low impact agricultural systems. There's this whole array of medicines derived from local plants and animals, poisons and tools and other technologies for hunting and fishing, architecture, knowledge of all kinds of local materials. I was at a meeting where there were some women from the Amazon speaking at a conference, and they were furious. They insisted we are not poor. We have our refrigerator, we have our medicine all around us. So this really ends up having an impact upon the way that we think about both poverty and development. So we tend to think, okay, if you're rural, if you're living in the system that's less impactful and appears less modern to us, it's not necessarily less modern. It's been developing over a very long period of time. And our system isn't necessarily without its problems. So I want to pull back and talk about Father Ivan Illich. Are any of you guys familiar with him? He's kind of a controversial figure. He's a bit of a firebrand. Illich, before he was posted in Cuernavaca, managed to get himself kicked out of a variety of different posts, and ultimately came to Cuernavaca and founded the Center for Intercultural Documentation in the 1960s. And he's actually a pretty influential intellectual figure, because one of the things he really observed throughout the 60s was that development, in his view, was actually a war against subsistence activities. So when we say subsistence, we're talking about the low impact things where people are providing for their own needs by their own farming. And sometimes that involves also some sort of trade, and it also involves being engaged in the economy. But at the core, you provide for your own needs. So this idea of the war on subsistence goes pretty far back. And another thing, before I get into this, I wanted to point out is that subsistency activity has a much lower ecological footprint, but also when we're looking at measures of poverty, it's completely ignored. So you can see all these statistics from the World Bank or from national development plans where they pat themselves on the back for having eradicated extreme poverty. But what's really happening is they're taking people who were feeding themselves using a subsistence model, completely eviscerating them environmentally, and then their only choice is to work for $1 a day at exploitation wages where they're starving. And then they say, we've raised the wages, we provided jobs, and we've eliminated extreme poverty by increasing the amount of money that people are making to above $1 a day. So subsistence activity is often off the radar in these economic assessments, and definitely off the radar in terms of development planning. Now, if we want to look at how far back the war on subsistence goes, we can go all the way back. And I know it's a long way back, but I can't help it. I'm an anthropologist. We like to do that kind of a thing. We can go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. So if you look at the time of the Industrial Revolution was happening, there was also a set of laws called the enclosure laws. And basically what happened there was people who were living in rural environments suddenly weren't allowed to hunt or forage to supply themselves with their food as they had been previously. That was considered poaching, and all of the woods was considered the king's wood. Part of the reason for doing this wasn't that the king needed his wood and there wasn't any threat from poaching. It was to force cheap labor into the cities. So in the cities, you had this labor force evacuating from the countryside where people were starving as a result of the enclosure laws and the war on subsistence. But in order to survive in the city, every member of your household that was over the age of 7 had to be working, and often working under horrible labor conditions where you got no rest. Their caloric intake usually barely met the bare minimum. And the only reason it was even able to meet the bare minimum was because of sugar, a really cheap and easy way of acquiring calories, which was coming in from slave plantations in Haiti. So from the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, labor exploitation and slavery were an integral part of this system. Another example, historical example of the war on subsistence is the East India Company, which is now made famous by the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. But at the time that Gandhi was organizing his movement, there were widespread famines happening across India, largely because England had forced the local population not to engage in subsistence activity in order to generate a greater, both generate a greater market for British goods, but also force people into providing labor for the extraction of resources that Britain could then profit off of. So a lot of Gandhi's movement, a lot of his agenda was actually a return to subsistence activity. Who knows whether that would have panned out or not? He was assassinated before we could really see what would have happened, but that was a core element in Gandhi's movement. In the United States, we also, as we were forcing indigenous peoples onto reservations, we outlawed hunting and gathering. Again, trying to, as part of a project of cultural genocide, but then also a way for us to profit off of selling goods to this new market. But the impacts of that can even be seen today, where on many reservations, you have these enormous food deserts, where sometimes the only place to get food is at a junk food at a gas station. And you have elevated rates of obesity and malnutrition in Native American reservations today as a result of that legacy. You can also see the war on subsistence in US activities in their acquisitions, like Hawaii before it became a state, and also Puerto Rico even today with the Jones Act, where not only was subsistence activity worked against, but also even local businesses, period, where people have to buy all of their goods from a company from the mainland. That kind of made its way into the news around the time the hurricane happened, because Puerto Rico's lack of local independence made it really difficult for people to get the basic goods and services that they needed if they have to buy everything from Walmart. So historically, let's go back and oh yeah, really quick. So another way of looking at things, as opposed to using this economic approach, is to look at things in terms of livelihoods. So instead of assessing poverty and development as the number of jobs and the amount of money someone has, you can really look at how people survive in a way that's comprehensive, that could include money, but also includes things like subsistence activity, that looks at vulnerability. Are you vulnerable to economic shocks? Are you vulnerable to environmental shocks? And looks at resilience as opposed to just condensing everything to a financial number. So if you take this livelihoods approach as opposed to an econometric approach to understanding the way people live and understanding social issues related to international development, you'd prioritize things like food security over things like profit and employment. So going back to Ecuador, Ecuador is one of those countries that has a big portion of the Amazon. You can see the stuff that's east of the mountains is all Amazonian. Again, we mentioned that it only requires about 2 to 3 hours of work a day. In some ways, it's the way that people operate prior to contact is more democratic than Western democracy. And there's 833 times, they're 833 times more sustainable with their particular way of life. Now, even though colonization of Latin America happened many, many years ago, it really wasn't until the 1950s that you had contact with a lot of the indigenous groups in the Amazon. For the most part, especially in Ecuador, the coast and the highlands were what was considered Ecuador, and the Amazon, while it was technically within its borders, was relatively uncontacted. So with the discovery of oil, and there's a lot of oil in the Amazon, that generated contact through the 1950s through the 1970s. So this process was actually extremely destructive. In some cases, land rights to subsurface petroleum are granted in exchange for maybe chickens and a bag of rice. And once contacted, people would be really excited about the opportunities to engage in this economy and have some of the wealth that the people who were brokering these deals had. And for about 5 years, they would be employed in the construction of refineries and roads. But as soon as that's done, indigenous people are pretty much left with nothing, right? Where previously, your way of life didn't involve money management. It really involved just, going out and hunting and farming for yourself. They're totally unprepared for this new environment, where as a result of the ecological damage that had happened, they had to walk 3 days instead of 3 hours in order to even find hunting ground, where all of the fish were destroyed from all of the crude that's being dumped and other toxic wastes that are being dumped in the water. So the entire food supply is wiped out, and people very quickly sold everything that they owned until they're largely left with nothing. So this is a picture of one of Texaco's crude pits, usually like the size of a Olympic swimming pool, and it's completely unlined, seeping into the groundwater. And then every time it rains, which it rains all the time in the Amazon, it just overflows. In some places, parts of the river system had 5% crude, but that's not all. They had all kinds of heavy metals. You had formation waters or production waters, which were incredibly toxic. It's like neon green stuff that if an insect lands and it dies, also stored in the exact same way. So there wasn't any potable water. When people bathe, it takes the oils off of their skin and they start getting dermatitis. Drinking the water produces all kinds of problems as well. There's extremely elevated rates of cancer and other illnesses that predominantly affect women and children, especially. So with Texaco in particular, 4.3 million gallons of hazardous waste was dumped every single day for 20 years in the Amazon, in the northern Amazon on the border with Colombia. Those open online pits I showed you and talked to you about. And from 1972 to 1990, its pipeline spilled 16.8 million gallons of crude into the Amazon headwaters. That's double the Exxon Valdez spill. And Exxon Valdez, like when the spill happens on the coast, it has a fraction of the impact of what happens in a freshwater system, where it can take decades and decades and decades and decades for anything to recover. As a result, there's rampant illness, a loss of access to food, and a complete end of any assets. So ultimately what happened was indigenous people, and this happened in most frontier towns. So you have this new frontier town, people are working in the refineries are usually skilled workers from the capital city or people from Canada, the United States. This is where the engineers come. So the people making the profit off of this are coming from the outside, and some people settle. So you'd have these growing mestizo towns with indigenous people living on the margins of them with absolutely no way to feed themselves outside of engaging in crime or engaging in involuntary sex work. So, you go to a hospital in Lago Agrio, which is named after Sour Lake, Texas, where Texaco was founded. And there's, as young as 14-year-old girls working outside of the hospital because that's one of the few places they can make public contact with the wealthy workers that are coming in from Canada, the United States, and the capital city of Quito. So by the end of the 1980s, 60,000 Zapado had been eliminated. 30,000 Tete were no longer present. And of 60, the whole Tete, like they were completely extinct. And of 60,000 Guarani, only 2,500 survived. So the environmental impacts were actually of a genocidal proportions. And it wasn't just limited to, the direct impacts of oil, but all of the impacts of the colonization of the Amazon and everything that people brought with them and exposure to the economy brought with them. So as crime intensified, what you saw happening was also an increase in right-wing violence. So there's a group that operates in Lago Agrio and Xuxufindi where Texaco had their installations. Now it's owned by Petroecuador. But largely they were ex-military that had previously, and ex-police that had previously worked security for the petroleum industry there. And so in Colombia, you have this whole cocaine thing going on. The most important ingredient for making cocaine from coca leaves is gasoline. You need it in much larger amounts. So here you can see there's all these little tiny bottles that are used in the process, but you need this giant jug here, the blue jug of gasoline, in order to get the coca alkaloids out of the coca leaves. So gasoline is heavily regulated. So being able to purchase black market gasoline fresh from the refinery in Xuxufindi and Lago Agrio was a way for these paramilitary groups to make money. Meanwhile, they performed a service, which, a lot of services such as, providing the mestizo community with a way of adjudicating conflicts, sometimes infrastructure projects. Paramilitaries in Colombia do this as well, but also crime. So they called it limpiezas or cleansings, where once a year they would pass out pamphlets, and for 7 days there was a curfew. And if you stayed out past curfew, and if you happened to be homeless or happened to be a sex worker, you would be murdered. So sometimes you would see 7 people murdered in the course of a week, and it happened every year. Other people had to flee where they were in other places without a social network and really having nothing. So you saw this happening, and it still happens to this day in the same territories, in Colombia as well, in areas where, in frontier towns, especially in places where there's oil, you have limpiezas or social cleansings where this continues. There's an attempt actually to prosecute these guys, but they wanted the names of their accusers and at the very highest levels of the judicial system in Ecuador. And since these guys are former police and military, those names got right back to them, and they started threatening the people that were bringing a legal case against them. So the human rights organizers actually ended up putting people in more danger since they had to record their names for the legal proceedings. In Colombia, the story is even worse. Paramilitaries were largely established by the United States in the 1950s to counteract leftist guerrillas, but they became their own sort of extra military businesses. For the most part, like in the case of Chiquita Bananas, but also Pick Your Poison, any other agricultural or mining activity, they clear land by showing up in a community, threatening to massacre the whole community, often during a demonstration killing, evicting all the indigenous people. And then once really poor mestizos are brought in from the capital cities, from the larger cities, they make sure that any labor organizers are assassinated, with Colombia having the largest incidence of assassinations of any country in the whole world. Meanwhile, these businesses allow them to invest in other things and run their own businesses, and then also become elected officials. So as local dons, they become important political people, to the point where Uribe, the president, had close ties to paramilitary infrastructure. So I think I'm potentially taking too long here, so I'm going to skip through some of this. Another case, iconic case, is Indonesia, where ExxonMobil operates a $2 billion, or operated a $2 billion per year natural gas operation, especially operating out of the far eastern corner here, Aceh, where civil war over the natural gas resources are brewing. Just like Chiapas, Aceh was the poorest province with high rates of child malnutrition, but also the wealthiest province in terms of natural resources. So in order to maintain this imbalance, there is a great deal of political oppression and military repression, largely funded by Mobil Oil and then later ExxonMobil when the two merged, including massacres. I'm not going to show you some of the more juicy stuff I've got here, but including massacres or protests against military brutality, rapes, torture, all sorts of horrible, indescribable things. At one point, there was a massacre of 150 people who had been rounded up together on Exxon, or at the time it was Mobil Oil's property. 50 of those were boarding school students, so very young people that were considered activists. So Exxon security, or Mobil Oil's security forces, massacred them and then used Mobil Oil's earth moving equipment to dig the hole in which they were buried. In one case, according to one report, one of the people that hadn't been killed in having been gunned down was then cut in half by the backhoe that was being used to dig the hole. And then Achenese people were then required to be the workers that cleaned the blood off of the equipment. So this, in a whole wide, like, if I went through the list of intense human rights abuses that had happened in Aceh, we would be here for, a few weeks. But this and other human rights abuses prompted Jafar Sadiq Hamza, who was from Aceh but had moved to New York to study political science at the New School in New York, to go back to Aceh and work on helping organize a legal case against ExxonMobil. While Jafar was doing this, he was disappeared. For a long time, nobody knew where he was, until later his body was found on the side of a road, wrapped in barbed wire and horribly mutilated with torture. So, this kind of work, trying to counteract this war and subsistence and the violences of development, is extremely dangerous. I mean, you guys are probably familiar with some of the more high-profile cases. There's Chico Mendes from Brazil, who was assassinated for his work on rubber. Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, who was organizing against Shell Oil, who was executed by the military. Jafar, who I just talked about, who was killed in 2000. And also, you're probably familiar with Sister Dorothy Stang, who also worked in Brazil. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Sister Dorothy was working for 40 years in Brazil. And in Brazil, you have, like in many other places, a homesteading of the Amazon, where poor people from the cities are pushed into the Amazon with the promise of free land. The idea is that they'll clear out the land, supply companies that these larger timber companies with wood as they clear cut it, and then move on and ultimately be displaced, mostly by cattle ranchers who are supplying, McDonald's with hamburgers, and also soy. Like, soy is a huge element in this, and multinational agribusiness that supplies, vegans with their tofu. So these vested business interests didn't want to see people hold on to their land, but one of the programs that Sister Dorothy was working on sustainable agriculture that would put a wrench in that process, by which the cattle companies and the soy and the other agribusiness companies come in and take all of the land. So her work put her in direct conflict with cattle and soy interests, and ultimately she was killed in 2005. Her work was commemorated in new protected areas, a US congressional resolution, and a United Nations Human Rights Award. So she had a really strong legacy that went beyond even what her existing work was already doing. So as I'm coming to a close here, I do want to point out that this pattern of assassination of environmentalists is intensifying. So as foreign direct investment intensifies, so do the assassinations of environmentalists. I mean, going back here, 2012 environmentalist activists were murdered in 2019 alone. And I don't have statistics for 2020 just yet, but in the period from 2002 to 2018, 1,700 environmental activists were assassinated. So it's incredibly important that we become increasingly active to have this protective space for human rights, protective human rights space for people like Sister Dorothy to do the work that they do. And it all, really at the end of the day comes back to what I learned from that first villager in Chiapas who told me that it's the presence of natural resource wealth that necessitates the violence here. So whether we're looking at Colombia or we're looking at Ecuador, Indonesia, natural resource wealth, and as it's increasingly exploited by intensification of foreign direct investment, becomes then the profit engine by which all of this violence then happens, and it is built into our systems of consumption and production. So I think did I go over too far? No, okay. So I'm leaving you with this calming image of some trees here after the distressing.
No, you have not gone too far. I think we all should be embarrassed of our lifestyle and how it affects the people that we don't even know.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm using a lot of comparisons between the United States and elsewhere, but a part of it's infrastructure. We don't even have a way to easily extricate ourselves from this system when our entire, what makes life survivable for much of us is being able to get, a cheap hamburger at McDonald's. So some of it is beyond our control, and there are wealthy echelons of society throughout the world that also are profiting from these same processes. But yeah, so I don't want to lay the guilt trip on too heavy, but I want to lay it on a little bit.
Well, Josh, I really thank you for doing this. It is very kind and generous of you. And I think I will leave you here tonight and go get a tent and camp out at my dad's farm and try to eke out a sustainable living with the earth. So you did a good job guilting me.
And there's some exciting things that can be done even at the grocery store in terms of getting grocery stores to have produce that comes from local farms. And you see that a lot, especially in Colorado. The produce is absolutely delicious, but you're going to Safeway and a lot of the stuff that you're getting is purchased locally. So sometimes it can be something small and simple, or choosing not to do something that's particularly wasteful as well when you really don't need it.
We have a question here, Josh. Do you have a book or books you would recommend to help inform friends on this topic?
I have some things that are a little bit dated. I think one of my, it doesn't really get too much into the human rights side, but it gets into this history of progress and its impact on Indigenous communities. There's a book called Victims of Progress by John Bodley, which is really excellent. And will really leave you kind of questioning how progress has operated since the 1960s.
Would you repeat that book title and author?
Victims of Progress by John Bodley. if you want to get a little abstract and a little bit more radical, Ivan Illich's Tools for Conviviality is where he touches, that's where he first touches on some of this war on subsistence, but he touches on a lot of things there, medicine, all kinds of other issues.
If anybody else wishes to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. Or if Josh would stop screen sharing and we could see everybody else, we could see if anybody raises their hand.
There we go.
All right, Sister Connie is asking, who really tracks this violence today?
So there's a variety of organizations. You have human rights agencies. The data that I used was put together by Global Witness. So there's a combination of human rights organizations and intergovernmental organizations, and even the State Department often has a human rights person that's tracking what's going on, and us academics.
Another question from Amy. What questions do you ask yourself before buying every single item? What can we do to be better consumers?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. And again, like I try not to be too hard on myself. You know, I am the worst offender of buying things that are, you know, made out of palm oil if it's a really delicious dessert. And I know I've been to Indonesia and I've seen all of Indonesia turned into a giant palm oil plantation. I know all the violence, the physical violence that surrounded that process. But there's some apps that you can use. There's something called Boycott, and you can put it on your phone and you can scan the barcode of something that you're thinking about buying, and it'll tell you what's actually happening. But sometimes, you know, it's like with petroleum, for example, you know, you want to go with Unocal 76, and you know, you had the Burmese military building a pipeline through the jungle and enslaving indigenous people to work as forced labor on the pipeline as they were going through. Or you can do ExxonMobil, who was involved in assassinations in Indonesia and all kinds of human rights abuses that they financed, or Shell Oil in Nigeria. So, and then they sell oil to each other. So it's kind of tricky. So one thing that you can also do is try to think about ways to reduce your ecological footprint. So when can you walk or take a bicycle instead of taking your car somewhere, or find other ways to have more fuel efficiency. But I think the bigger, for me, like the way I tend to focus my energy is mostly on advocacy. So if I can find ways to stay informed of particular struggles that are going on, like legal struggles in Ecuador, there were cases where people were taking legal cases against a refinery that exploded on the coast. And I was pretty organized in organizing letter writing campaigns or helping to support organizations that were working to support those legal processes. There's a big one happening in Ecuador where they're saying there wasn't free prior informed consent for the oil activity that was happening in Guarani territory. And this amazing woman organized, mostly women throughout Guarani communities, in order to take this big legal case, and is largely winning. So the more that we pay attention to those things and find ways to raise the profile of those kinds of activities, the more strength they can have in helping the Guarani defend their own territory from increasing exploitation. There's also, for a long time, it just closed. There was an active case on ExxonMobil in Indonesia, but that wasn't successful. There was a successful case against Texaco in Ecuador, where it was one of the largest fines that any company had ever had to pay ever. They had wanted to try it in Ecuador, thinking they could buy out the government and the judicial system more easily, but it didn't work in their favor when Correa, who was a little bit more to the left and anti-Western companies, ended up getting elected. So then they turned around and said, no, we want it to be tried in the United States, and they were able to discount the ruling. But the ruling in Ecuador is still there. It still stands. It's just not being enforced. So there are some efforts to shift. There's a lot of international pressure from the United States to not enforce that, and sometimes that's also exerted through international lending organizations like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. So Ecuador's access to international development loans then becomes contingent on having an environment that is friendly to international development and international corporations. So holding companies accountable to the things that they do is considered an unfriendly environment and makes them an investment risk. So, so the government isn't even very supportive. The current government isn't very supportive of even attempting to enforce this legal case. But there are movements in places like Europe, and then maybe eventually here, to try to get Texaco to observe the case. And the people that were involved in that case, even Texaco's lawyers responded by this flurry of criminal cases, charging people with things like drug dealing or all manner of things, usually completely unsubstantiated. So everyone who testified in the case, every single person had a legal record and couldn't travel to the United States because they were considered criminals because of Texaco's lawyers bringing and being instrumental in bringing all these charges against them. And now they're saddled with, you talk to them and they're just exhausted, and they're saddled with all of these personal legal battles that they could raise money to fight Texaco, but how do you raise money to fight some other personal accusation? And it's telling that every single one of them was accused, right? So things like supporting their legal defense. And there's great organizations that maybe don't help people with that, but do help communities with their legal defenses, called Earth Justice. And they do a lot of great stuff. And they were instrumental in one case I worked on, helping to broker a threat of a case before the Organization of American States if the local court system didn't compensate people who had lost children because a refinery exploded and the children were running from the flames in their homes and jumped in the river, and it was just pure crude being dumped into the river and died. So organizations like Earth Justice, the Pachamama Alliance, they all do amazing, really important work in supporting Indigenous communities and their resistance.
There's a question here. Could you say more about how the multinational development is destroying species?
If you consider when I'm in Ecuador, if I go down the street for lunch, I'm gonna have a chicken that was grown in somebody's backyard, most likely. If I go here, everything from the sauces to the vegetables, it all comes from these enormous agribusiness companies that then displace enormous tracts of land, and those destroy ecosystems. And a lot of times you have this complex where as we increasingly globalize, and the Green Revolution largely destroyed small scale farming in the United States to replace it with these enormous agribusiness companies. As we increasingly globalize, the impact spreads. So this smaller scale farming activity ends up being displaced with this much more destructive large scale monocultures. So monoculture, for example, if you have, instead of having a farm that has a variety of different foods that then you can rotate to maintain nitrogen levels, if you displace that and you have this enormous banana plantation or palm oil plantation or tomatoes or whatever you might have, you need fertilizers, you need pesticides, all of those are from petroleum products, which then relate to other problems related to mining. And then on top of that, they contaminate the soil with all of this poison from the pesticides. And the only way the plants are even able to survive is if you bought a genetically modified seed from Monsanto that is in a package with the specific fertilizers and pesticides. So even agribusiness companies aren't making any money. They're mostly supported by subsidies from the government. Monsanto is making all that money, but because the soil is completely destroyed, it's hard to go back to that. And as that model increases, we end up increasing the amount of territory that we're using and destroying other ecosystems. So in places like Indonesia, where palm oil is just out of control, you have some of the largest megafauna diversity anywhere. It's amazing. You have one of the few places where there's orangutans, these crazy like things with giant fingernails that look like bears, like it's elephants. But it's completely and totally destroyed just in the past 10, 20 years from palm oil. And as these companies come in, they displace people that were able to coexist in these environments with rice paddies and local smaller scale economies with these enormous, palm oil plantations that are then supplying the whole world. And sometimes, they clear cut it for timber, they make money there, then they get environmental money to reforest, but it's really African palm, genetically modified African palm, and then they call it a carbon sink forest and get carbon credits for it. So even the like environmental, especially the mainstream environmental mechanisms are actually facilitating this destruction of biodiversity and resilience, because that forest can't be anything compared to the carbon sink that the peat forest was prior to this African palm monoculture.
One other one here says, what kind of policies should we be pushing in light of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tricky one. So there's two pathways. Some people like to increasingly talk about climate adaptation, but we need to definitely be looking at mitigation and adaptation at the same time and thinking about how we can reduce the use of fossil fuels, right? Which is largely, we had all this energy in the 1990s with UN organized conferences, and somehow today we're in 1,000 times worse position than we were before, and we're not even really bothering to talk about how to mitigate fossil fuel expenditures to the same degree that we were previously. So in some cases, these adaptation strategies are like, well, we need Monsanto to create drought-resistant crops, but who's going to pay for that? If you have the Sahara Desert is expanding as since the 1970s, it went from being relatively green to just all desert, and all the people that live off of the grazing land, off of the cattle and off of the camels, the nomads, they're all pushed into starvation as a result of this process. And they starve every single year during the dry season, where they're left eating their cattle feed, and then even then they don't have enough. And like I was there, the child malnutrition clinics are full of dying children. And then you have, Alaska, where people are also going hungry because as the permafrost melts, entire towns are having to be evacuated, and people aren't able to acquire, especially in Inuit communities, acquire the food that they used to be able to hunt before. Or in Bangladesh, where you have cyclones increasing in intensity and more farmland is becoming underwater. And once there's a huge cyclone, it's solidified. There's all kinds of salinity. So people are then pushed into the cities where, they end up working in really exploitative manufacturing or clothing in the textile industry. And much of Bangladesh, like a huge portion of Bangladesh, is going to be underwater, or some islands that are completely underwater. So, I don't know, we're already seeing these incredible prices that are being paid. The climate crisis is already here. But if we only focus on adaptations, and if we only look to the private sector for solutions, then we're not necessarily going to be resolving anything. What I'd really like to see are things like alternative technologies, and increase in an enforcement of the carbon cap. So we talk about the carbon trade system as well. Companies can just buy carbon credits, but they have to purchase an offset. But as we've seen, they run out of offsets, and then they just are like, well, let's just count this as an offset, and we'll count that as an offset. And there's no regulation as to whether the offsets are really mitigating anything, right? Like I was talking about with the African palm. So why don't we actually have a hard cap, period? And in parts of California, the Air Quality Management District, using more of an environmental justice model, is trying to cap certain emissions. And then they work with different agencies to try to see how they can do that. So at the ports of LA, there was a move to electrify the ports. So all of the boats would then plug into the electrical grid, and they could get their electricity from a combination of solar power, wind power, hydroelectric power. All of these have other impacts, but not as damaging as diesel. Similarly, there was a program to, and this one was a little bit rougher, they're really good at putting the onus on poor people. So there was a program to force all of the truckers to have a specific kind of truck that wouldn't produce as many emissions. Now that program ultimately, both of those programs were ultimately challenged at the federal level and shut down. But they were great while they lasted. There's also things like maglev. If we had our goods movement infrastructure on like a maglev system, like you see in the high-speed trains in Europe, and there's 3 different companies that are working on that in the United States, you could dramatically reduce emissions, like in one fell sweep. But when you're looking at like funds for technology and private and pilot projects, they're chopping at the bit to have the opportunity even just to do a demonstration project, because then that could make their investment capital in this new technology worth it. But a QMD won't do it because they only want to give money to like BNSF or the major vested interests that already have control of the city and state lobby. So putting pressure at like the city level and at the state level to develop these alternative technologies and make use of them in order to meet hard goals and put a hard cap on our emissions, I think is a really important step, but one that so far there isn't the political will to do. Sorry if that got a little technical and I lost some of you.
If anybody else has a question, you could either put it in the chat or raise your hand. Here's one that says, is there an international organization that gives any hope of regulation, consumption, or alternative lifestyles that would be globally sustainable?
So, I mean, there are smaller organizations like Sister Dorothy's organization. There's a network of, sustainable agriculture in Indonesia, where you have all of these people coming together to try to defend this particular way of life. In the United States, there used to be an organization called the Rural Development Fund. I don't think they're operating anymore, but they did something pretty cool where they would take farm workers from, so people, you may not know this, but since the 1950s, Dole and Chiquita have had a relationship where they can bring people in, farm workers in, to work at a pick rate on their plantations in the United States. So you'll have people that are living in pretty much the same conditions as Mexico, or sometimes worse, but in California. So there'll be these labor camps. Their houses are basically just a concrete block, nothing else, an aluminum roof. And just inside there's stacks and stacks and stacks of ramen noodles, because that's all anyone can afford to eat, because they're getting paid a pick rate. So they have these giant machines that are behind them as they're getting sprayed with all of these poisonous, cancerous pesticides. out in the sun all day putting vegetables into this machine, and at the end they can't even afford the vegetables that they're picking because they're only getting about $2 an hour, which isn't enough to survive. So you'll see, like, in order to feed their families, it's just ramen noodles and nothing else, right? So there was an organization that, and then they have to go back to Mexico to work on the plantations there once their seasonal period in the United States is over. And a lot of times, the poisons like methyl bromide and for strawberries is extremely poisonous, and they'll just kind of float into their houses, and they'll have to evacuate their houses for periods of time because everybody's super sick. So the working conditions are awful, and there was an organization working with people that were working under those conditions to get them out of working there, and then also get land where they could do organic farming, and then they could sell, the small scale farming at like the higher niche price point. Part of the problem that they ran into was that the regulations for organic farming are pretty strict. The land has to at least had 3 years where there wasn't any pesticides on it. And acquiring land is really difficult because we're basically out of land, right? But that was an interesting organization that was taking people out of that model towards a more local economy, and also they would be supplementing their own diets with what they grew. So yeah, there are organizations. I really wish that the funding for organizations that focus on subsistence activity internationally had even a fraction of what other kinds of organizations do. So our funding priorities, and then both from foundations, especially from the government, never prioritizes that kind of work. So it's few and far between. Also, environmental justice organizations. You've got some amazing organizations that work on making these companies accountable so that they can't continue to do this, whether they're labor violations, whether it's human rights violations, whether it's environmental illnesses. You have some amazing organizations in the Los Angeles area, but a lot of times it'll be like, my friend who she can only do it because she's married and she has the free time to spend all of her days trying to fight this Superfund site. Or, Jesse, who lives in a garage and just barely has a shoestring budget, but has been behind some major policy changes for the entire state of California because his work in Watsonville, where air quality is some of the worst in the entire state. So there are like all of these little tiny organizations, or Internationally Acción Ecológica, an organization I work with in Ecuador that provides legal and medical expertise to indigenous organizations and the indigenous organizations themselves that are mobilizing in order to make companies accountable and change their practices. So it'd be really great to see funding priorities shift where small organizations like that were getting their fair share of the foundation and government development funds.
And we'll let this be the last question. What are the next couple environmental refugee crises that you're anticipating that we might still have some time to successfully address or assist with?
I mean, it's difficult because I can't really say that I have my toe in the whole world to prioritize one over the other. There's a huge development crisis happening in Venezuela right now with refugees all over the place. And I think as interventions in Venezuela increase, I think there's an opportunity there to shift away from this focus on Venezuela's oil economy to some sort of like local sustainable resilience. The Amazon is definitely a huge one. The ecological changes there are dramatic and intense and only intensifying over time. And then, the Sahel as well, the area in the Sahara Desert, that's where you have the poorest people in the entire world, where people are barely eking out a survivable living. And as well, the same people, you have these historical boundaries drawn during the colonial era that divided communities like the Tuaregs and made them ethnic minorities, which are now at odds with the national government. So they don't even get food aid. Like when we went to do a project with the British Red Cross and the Tuaregs, they hadn't been getting food aid for since the 1970s. They got it once, and they're people hardest hit. So there's this sort of isolation of these groups, and they have this strong desire to reconstitute Azawad, so their own homeland that spans multiple countries. And when you had the armed insurrection in Mali, that was very much tied to that. So while they're not getting development assistance from us for the most part, then this extreme deprivation actually becomes a really important breeding ground in which Al-Qaeda can come in and recruit people, and other extremist groups can also recruit people for their operations that are happening in the Sahara Desert. And sometimes they're providing medicine and food that no one else is. So I think we ignore these things at our own risk in terms of not only the humanitarian cost, but also the potential for increased violence.
Well, Josh, we really appreciate your presentation this evening. And I'm just overwhelmed with everything that how everything is connected together. So we thank you very much. I hope everybody else appreciated and agrees that there's so much that we don't know, that we ourselves don't know how we are affecting everybody else because of our lifestyle or our buying, just what we do. So thank you very much for your presentation this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Our next Franciscans for Earth event is April the 13th. It will be it's a film called Seeds of Change. And if you register for that, I will send you the link for you to watch it from the evening of April the 10th to the evening of April the 13th. You watch it on your own, but I send you the link. And then on the evening of the 13th, those who wish to have a discussion about the film will have another link to a Zoom discussion at 7 o'clock on April 13th. We also then in May have the speaker Belden Lane on May the 11th, and he's going to speak about trees and our relationship with trees and nature. So we hope that many of you will be with us again, and we thank you all for being with us this evening, and have a great rest of this evening and the rest of this week. So thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Sister Cheryl.
Thank you.
And thanks for
Yeah.
all of the sisters.
Thanks, Sister Cheryl.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Bye, Bernadette. Bye, Mom.
I should have asked if Mom wanted to say anything.
She left me out the hook. She could have grilled me.
Now, Josh, I sent cookies over to your mom yesterday, so maybe you can get over there quick before they're all gone and have some.
That's gonna be terrible on my diet. What kind of cookies are they?
Thanks, Josh. Good.
Thanks.
I put a
Yeah.
comment saying thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.